Hello everyone. Hello. This is Eric Rudin speaking. I'm here to show you some Distant Worlds 2 today for the new Hyperspeed update that we have coming out at the end of this week. I'm going to pause for a moment here before I really get going just to make sure that everything is actually streaming and looking good, that you can hear me, and that there are folks here. So if you're in the chat, please let me know if you can hear everything fine. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. I see a response that everything is okay. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so this is Distant Worlds 2, the Hyperspeed update. So you may recall we released the Aurora update a few months ago, along with the first DLC, the Factions Icar and the Daiute. And by the way, you're not going to see me today. My webcam unfortunately broke. Ordered a new webcam. That one was dead on arrival, so you're going to have to listen without seeing today, but I will show you the game. So we started working back around September on a major project internally to deal with some of the performance issues that people had talked with us about since release. We became aware not long after release that there were some pretty significant performance issues, especially on some systems and in some very large galaxies especially. And we'd been improving performance all along, and the Aurora update saw a lot of performance improvements, but these were of a different type than what we tried with the Hyperspeed update. The Hyperspeed update involved a lot of re-engineering of really low-level stuff in the game, in the engine, to try to take full advantage of system hardware and try to get the living galaxy to effectively come alive more than it had been able to in Distant Worlds 2 in the past. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk through some of those improvements. I'm going to go through the change list for Hyperspeed, which is coming out later this week on Friday, and I'm going to showcase some of the things as well, sort of give you a guided tour of the changes. The biggest thing you're going to see is a massive improvement in performance. Now, I'm going to show you something that explains what I mean by that, because it's very easy, I think, when you look at previous updates like Aurora, which did improve performance a lot, to not necessarily see all of the performance improvements that are going to be in Hyperspeed. So let me start by showing you something. We have a particular save file among many that customers have sent in for us since release that we used as a sort of benchmark to make our performance improvements against. We've got several of these. And I'm going to show you how this save file looks when it's running under the Aurora update, which is our most recent official update, and how it looks when running under the Hyperspeed update. So if we take a look here, this is the Aurora update, and this is from a location that has around 2,000 ships all told fighting in a battle. And what you can see here, you can see how it's sort of stuttering and jerking. I don't have the sounds right now playing for you, so it's not too overwhelming, but the sounds are fuzzing out, crackling. There are all kinds of problems going on with things kind of moving very slowly performance-wise. It's resolving, which before the Aurora update, it actually really didn't resolve much at all. The Aurora update moved forward to where it could resolve. But I think as we scroll along, you'll kind of see that things are not particularly smooth. You see some ships that are sort of stuck together for performance reasons. That's how the save starts out. This was from a much older version originally. But the key thing I want to show you, because what Aurora did is Aurora took a lot of the processing power of your system and it focused it on what you were looking at that moment. Okay, so that could still allow things like that battle to proceed, though a little bit stuttery. But now look at this galaxy. Look at all the ship symbols. And if you watch, you'll see them moving. Some of them are moving, some of them are not. Some of them are moving only very, very occasionally, or not at all. There's a lot of unevenness in terms of the updates that are going on in the galaxy, and this was what we were seeing in Aurora, in very large galaxies and very late games. Now, to be fair, this save is a bigger save than what my own system, where I'm testing this on, would normally be able to support, but you still see this sort of uneven background update process going on. And this is one of the key things we were trying to fix, because you could be looking at a battle, and a lot of processing power would be devoted to that part of the living galaxy, but other parts of the galaxy would not be moving as fast, and that could create all kinds of distortions, what we would call a quantum effect, where what you were observing was getting more performance, other parts were not. I'm going to now switch over. That's the Aurora side, so now I'm going to switch over to what this looks like on the Hyperspeed update. So we're looking at the battle itself on Hyperspeed, and what you can see here is with the battle itself, things are resolving more smoothly here. We're seeing a lot more weapon effects. We're seeing the ships moving in a way that's not particularly stuttery. There are occasional minor hiccups. I mean, it is 2,000 ships fighting in the same location, and the galaxy has about 100,000 ships all doing their separate things now. But you can see as we move along, everything is looking much more smooth. We're seeing a lot of things just constantly resolving, whether we're looking at them or not. And when we zoom out from this battle to the galaxy view, you're going to start seeing the single biggest change here is you're going to start seeing that the galaxy itself, even while we're looking at these things, even while these battles are going on, all the other battles everywhere else are resolving at a similar rate, and the galaxy itself is not lagging behind just because you're looking at what's going on here. And that's what we've been seeing with Hyperspeed, is the changes we've made, which took it's really since September of last year that we've been making these changes. Now we're zooming in to a similar part here. I want you to look at the ship symbols here. This is basically the same part of the galaxy that we were looking at with Aurora. And now if you look at those ship symbols, you can see everything is active, everything is moving. There's a lot more work getting done in the living galaxy. Everything is basically doing what it should be doing. And you can see a tiny little hiccup here as it pauses to catch up on one of the threads. But one of the problems we had with previous versions, where we were sorting out the performance issues in the low level, and I'm not a developer, so I can't speak to the exact details, but we were not taking full advantage of multi-threading. We had instances where the game was sort of stepping on itself and things were waiting on each other, and that would create a situation where you could have a game that was a very big game that needed a lot to get done. And this is our new updated performance overlay here, which I'll talk about it a bit more in a bit. You could have a lot of stuff that needed to be done, but the game might only still be running at, let's say, 40, 50, 60% CPU usage because things were waiting on each other. One of the things you'll see with Hyperspeed is that it will, by default, use a lot more of your CPU and in some cases your GPU. And I'll go over the in-game settings where we let you adjust that. But by default, it will use a lot more because it's not stepping on itself as much in the background. These are a lot of really low-level improvements that took us months to actually figure out, implement, and then it's been through months of public beta testing on the beta branches since Aurora came out to make sure that we had fixed all the bugs that came from all those performance improvements and sorted out all the instances where things could get less than ideally asynchronous. Alright, so having shown that comparison, let me now just switch over to the game itself, and I'm going to have that playing in the background while I talk through a few things. So we're going to start with the basically the change list, and I'm just going to go through it. So we'll start with the crash fixes. We have, as always, a lot of crashes that we find. Some of them are because as we change things in this, we created some crashes that needed fixing, but some of these are, again, some long-standing rare crashes, edge cases where people still seeing issues. And one of the big pieces of feedback we saw in Aurora, which made Hyperspeed our top focus after Aurora was released, was that some people were still having crashes, hardware problems, and performance problems. And I'm going to walk through some of the game settings that you can also use in Hyperspeed if you are experiencing those issues, if you are experiencing any crashing or any other problems once you launch Hyperspeed. So let's take a look at some of those. So right here we have our game settings. And you've seen this before if you've played Distant Worlds 2. But what we've done is we've added a lot more options here. And we want everyone to be aware of all the options that exist here now, especially from the standpoint of what you can do to customize your system for performance and for stability. So first off, and very important, is the rendering mode. So we support DirectX 11, Vulkan 1, and Vulkan 2. Now the game by default loads in DirectX 11, but what we found is that on some video cards, especially AMD video cards with certain drivers, that Vulkan is a lot more stable and performant. And so we recommend that if you're having any kind of crash or performance issues, especially if you're running on an AMD video card, try one of the Vulkan options. Try either one or two, see what your card supports. If you try it and it doesn't work for you, just in case, some people in those cases, they can get stuck, please look at the README. There is a command line option to revert your settings, or you can just delete your settings file. But you can just use a command line to go back to DirectX 11 if it doesn't launch for you. We also have VSync now, which is enabled by default. And we have these two maximum FPS and system load target settings, which are quite important. Now you see I've got it set to 240 max FPS and 100 system load. The max FPS here is going to determine, in combination with the VSync, sort of how much it's going to look for from your video card. So if you don't want the video card being used as much, you can drag this down to whatever max FPS you're comfortable with. If the system load target, if your CPU usage is higher than you would like, because Hyperspeed will use as much of your CPU as it can get, you can drag the system load target down to free up more of your CPU for other things. Okay, and by default, the higher this goes, the more of your CPU DW2 will use, the more cores and threads it will look to use, and it will spread pretty evenly across all cores and threads at this point. But if you're doing other stuff in the background, that may not be what you want, so use these settings to customize. Or if, for example, you're on a laptop and you want, again, lower usage while you're gaming. Texture streaming was previously on by default. It's now off by default. We found that that performs better on most video cards for most players, but this can reduce memory usage on some systems. There might be some edge cases where it works better to have it on your system. I'd recommend starting with it off as it is and leaving it that way unless you see issues with things, textures and models loading in too slowly. Here's a whole bunch of other new settings that we've got. So we've got here particle effects now. And again, depending on your system, we've seen people run Distant Worlds 2 even on some integrated graphics now with the Hyperspeed update. But there are going to be some graphics cards that can't perhaps support everything that Distant Worlds 2 needs. And you can look at these in those cases if you've got a system that's below the minimum spec, or if you're just troubleshooting a problem and trying to figure out what improves stability or performance on your system. There are particle effects, weapon effects, the unit damage overlay, and the nebula storm display effects that can all be turned off to allow you to customize the performance and the stability for your own system. And obviously, the goal is for those to work on everyone's system who's within spec. If you have a problem and turning one of these off fixes it, do let us know. The next thing I should mention here is that in Hyperspeed, we actually have made a lot of big improvements with the nebulas. A lot of folks were telling us previous to Hyperspeed that the nebula effects in the game and the way that we were doing them was on some graphics cards causing a lot of performance slowdown and using a lot more of the GPU than it should. We found the problem with that and we fixed it, and we added additional customizations here again for people who are maybe below minimum spec, where they want to reduce the density of the nebulas or turn off the storm effects, or just don't like the flashing storm effects for other reasons. You can adjust that now. We also had some people give us reports, and it turned out that on a very specific type of monitor, there could be an issue with how we were originally doing the background star field in the game, where it could cause flickering that was driving some players crazy. We figured out the problem with that, we fixed it, and we added some new star field level for basically the density of the star field and the opacity of the star field sliders, so that you can adjust the background star field to what looks best on your system. We added additional volume effects. You now have the general effects volume for things like weapons, fire, explosions, hyperdrives. You have the user interface effects volume. You have the nebula storm effects volume and the music volume, and you can now adjust when the music changes, when the scene changes, or just when the track ends, if you found that the tracks were changing too quickly and that was jarring. And everything that was previously, there were a few things like some of the special effects for some places in the nebulas and for black holes that didn't seem to be respecting these. So wherever we found that something wasn't respecting the volume slider, we fixed that. There was also a problem on some systems where people were having a problem with the Windows volume mixer and Distant Worlds 2 not playing nice with it. That's also been fixed. Alright, so that I think walks us through those, and hopefully that'll be a good reference for folks to customize Hyperspeed and Distant Worlds 2 to work best on their system. Let me go a little bit further through the change list. So, graphical issues. We also found that in some cases we had some issues, this is getting a little bit technical, but we found that we had some issues where some models were not loading perfectly, and some of that, let me just turn this down a little bit, and some of that was because of an issue with some of the 16-bit and 32-bit indices. We fixed that. That has fixed some minor nagging issues and some weird issues that were happening, especially with some of the newer ships. We have let me talk about the performance a bit more. We've added this performance overlay here. So if we look at the top left, let me turn this down just a little bit more so you guys don't have to fight against the weapon effects. So I don't know how much of this you can see, but I'm going to walk you through a little bit of this. If you hit the Shift tilde key combination, then you see the overlay that appears here in the top left, and it's got a lot more information than before. That'd be useful for us mainly if you have a performance problem to turn on this overlay and sort of send in a screenshot or video us showing what's going on here while you're having a performance problem, if you still have one with Hyperspeed. But one of the things it does now, it also tracks what the performance of the background update loop is, which is the one that's basically calculating all the operations that are going on in the living galaxy. It takes a look at how the parallelism is doing in terms of what it's using for your cores and threads. Takes a look at the memory usage and all the garbage collection that's going on. Takes a look at everything that's going on in the galaxy now as far as locations and systems and ships and so on. So it's a useful thing to let us know, what's going on. And if we get a save from you in the future, we will absolutely be using that to help us troubleshoot. We really made, in terms of the performance improvements, I'll just go into a little bit of what we did here. As we go through the change list, there was a lot of draw overhead that was reduced by as much as 75% in some cases. We freed up a lot of the main drawing thread, which other things were being loaded onto, which could sometimes cause like some of the strange issues where some of the sound or music would break up in some cases when things went under heavy load. We've improved all the garbage collection, which is basically memory management on .NET, which is what our game is written in C#, which uses .NET. We've basically improved how the game manages what it's putting on the different cores and threads a lot better. We've resolved a lot of the conflicts that were related to some of the various components of the UI interacting with the rest of the game. So when we had all these types of lists, like your military ships, to make sure that those were not, the updates to those lists, especially on very large galaxies, were not causing hitching to go on in other parts of the game. And as I showed before with the comparisons between the Aurora video and the Hyperspeed video, the background simulation rate in the galaxy is just vastly improved. I mean, we're seeing in some games 10 times, 100 times, even 1,000 times more improvement when it comes to what's going on in the galaxy, in the background, in terms of what's actually being resolved. We have, I mentioned the nebula performance optimization, and I mentioned sort of the fixing of the quantum effect, where some things that were in the background that you weren't currently looking at weren't being processed often enough. We also fixed a bunch of issues with how debris and fighters and some other things that were accumulating in large numbers were handled. Alright, then the last step is memory management. So memory management has been improved. Now, because it's one of those things, because more work is getting done in Hyperspeed, because more is going on, it will over time use quite a bit of memory. It will use as much memory as it can get access to, but in terms of what it's doing with that memory, it's doing a lot more with it. You know, for the same situation as in Aurora, it's more efficient with the memory, but it's also doing a lot more, so over time it will use more memory. We fixed a lot of issues that would cause some crashes and other things like that related to memory management as well. Alright, so that I think kind of summarizes the performance side. Before I get into the other parts of it, I do want to show just that Aurora and Hyperspeed comparison one last time, and then I'm going to get into some of the gameplay improvements that we've made. So one more time here. This is looking at a save file that we were using for testing that has 100,000 ships, very large galaxy. This is the Aurora update, where we had improved performance enough that this gigantic battle with 2,000 ships could actually resolve, but it was slow, it was stuttering, and it was having issues with sound effects and not showing all the weapon effects. And I'm going to just show this, and then I'm going to show the comparison video one more time of how this looks in the Hyperspeed update, which is coming out at the end of this week. And once you get a sense of how this battle looks, then when it zooms out to the galaxy, I want you to pay attention when it zooms out to the galaxy view of what you see in terms of all those moving ships in the galaxy, and watch on the Aurora update how those resolve and how often they update, and then we'll compare that when we look at the Hyperspeed video to how all those resolve on Hyperspeed. And I think you'll see that under the Hyperspeed update, the galaxy is much more alive and much more able to scale well on systems. So again, here we are on the Aurora update, and take a look at all these ship symbols here. And I think you'll notice a lot of them aren't moving, and when they do move, some of them don't. The game is struggling with this huge save, with getting everything in the galaxy to do what it should be doing. So we're going to watch this for a little while, and I think if you watch, you'll see some of those symbols never move, and others of them only move once in a while. And that's a sign of the background update process in the galaxy sort of getting choked and struggling to keep up with all the work that needs to be done in the galaxy. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over now to the Hyperspeed update, and we're going to look at that same battle, and then we're going to zoom out to the galaxy and watch the same symbols going on. And I'm running all this right now on a 10th gen Intel CPU, for the record. So you'll see in the battle here in the Hyperspeed update, we're seeing all the weapon effects. All the ships are moving smoothly, even though there's 2,000 ships in this battle and many fleets. One of the other things you'll see here is no matter whether we're zooming in on it or not, all the ships in all the different areas are active. They're not just active when we zoom in on them. And when we finish watching this battle and zoom out to the galaxy, I think then you'll see the biggest difference, because in Aurora, it did tend to still grab a lot of the system resources for whatever you were looking at, but that could create an effect where things you weren't looking at lagged behind. And in Hyperspeed, that's not nearly as much of an issue. Again, the performance on that is like 10, 100, sometimes 1,000 times better than Aurora in terms of what's going on in the background. So we're just watching everything in the battle proceed smoothly here with 2,000 ships, fighters, all that. So now we're going to zoom out, and now we're looking at that exact same part part of the map we're going to look at, and I want you to pay attention to what's going on in the galaxy now. We're not looking at any specific point, we're just looking at what's going on, and look at all these ship symbols. And previously you saw a lot of these were not moving, they were not going about their missions because the CPU couldn't keep up with what was needed for the background processing of the galaxy. Now in the Hyperspeed update, you can see that it does. You'll still see, like what happens here, an occasional hiccup where it catches up, usually on garbage collection and stuff. But this is again 100,000 ships going all at the same time in the galaxy. And you can see that in comparison to the Aurora video that I just showed you, this is a whole world of difference. This is just basically a completely living galaxy with hyperspeed. Okay? So I'm going to pause that here, and I'm going to go back to just the game itself. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to now talk through some of the gameplay improvements that we made now that I've hopefully showed you the significant performance improvements. And I will say for those of you, let me catch up with chat for a bit before I start that. So my secondary backup system here is an Intel 6th generation 4-core system. And some of these saves that I showed you, like the one with the big 2,000 ship battle and 100,000 ships in the galaxy, those are way beyond what we recommend that you play on a 4-core system. But I will say that I can actually play it on a 4-core system in the Hyperspeed update now. It's not smooth, but it's not supposed to be on a 4-core system, but it can actually play it, and previously without Hyperspeed, it was completely unplayable on that 4-core system. I'm finding that performance on all the systems that we've tried Hyperspeed on is greatly improved compared to Aurora. Yes, 1.1.4.4, which is the current public beta, is the Hyperspeed update. That's what's becoming the Hyperspeed update later this week. We've had it in beta testing for several months now through many iterations. Let me see if there are any other changes here in the chat. Bug about the dangerous position. We're aware of that. We think that actually precedes the Hyperspeed update, but that's actually one of the things that we're looking into now for the next round of public betas to improve that occasional. Now, in my experience, the threat locations will eventually clear, but there's a delay in them clearing, and we will be looking into that in the next round of betas. Alright, so let's talk about the behavior. One of the other things that we got as feedback from the Aurora updates was that there were still issues with ship and fleet behavior, in many cases relating to fuel tankers, and relating to fighters, and relating to troop loading for invasions. So we got a lot of good examples of those from players, and we proceeded to tackle all those areas. So first off, with respect to fuel tankers and fleet refueling, that's vastly improved. What we saw was, especially in cases where you had a manual fleet mixed with fuel tankers, a lot of bad things could happen. Now in all cases, whether it's automated fleets or manual fleets with fuel tankers, they should behave themselves quite well. And I'm just going to read a little bit here about how fuel tankers should work from our update notes. So when fuel tankers are low on fuel, they will either load fuel from a refueling point, or they will mine fuel from a nearby fuel source. When they're assigned to a fleet, fuel tankers will monitor and refuel fleet ships as needed, while attempting to stay clear of any battles. When they're not assigned to a fleet, they will refuel any ship in your empire that needs it, starting with fleets, then other military ships, then exploration ships, and then finally all other ships. And when fuel tankers are assigned to a fleet, and this is also new in Hyperspeed, if the fleet detects that it needs to refuel, it will first check whether its fuel tankers can completely refuel the fleet. If so, and the tankers are within fuel range, and the fleet location is not too dangerous, the fleet will signal the tankers to top them up, and it'll wait at its location until the tankers finish refueling them. Fleets in general are more likely to refuel and understand that they shouldn't be trying to complete missions when they are lower on fuel. They interact with their fuel tankers better, and with the problem saves that we were seeing before, with fuel tankers, the issues there are entirely resolved. With respect to troop loading, we had been given some examples of cases where fleets were not proceeding with invasions as quickly as they should. Although invasions were happening and invasion fleets were loading troops, there were cases where they could get stuck for a long time in a troop loading process longer than they should. We figured out the problems that were still hampering that in some cases, and we resolved those. We also still got some saves that showed that, especially in systems that were under high load, where the galaxy was requesting a lot of demand, a lot of things it needed from the system, that fighters were not boarding carriers fast enough, and that could leave fleets in a situation where they were preparing to jump, waiting for the fighters to load, and not actually jumping, just kind of creeping along. Those issues have also been resolved. So the end result of that is much better fleet behavior in our experience with the Hyperspeed update. I'm going to zoom in here a bit just so you can see something other than ship symbols while I talk. So we'll just let you guys watch this a bit. This will be a little prettier than just the ship symbol view. All right, resource logistics. So one of the things that came about from the Hyperspeed update process was we did have some instances that came out of the performance change process, but other instances that were pre-existing, where we could see that there were improvements that needed to be made to resource logistics. And that means how resources move across the galaxy, how they're managed by your private economy, and also that related to some degree with the fuel tankers and with fuel usage. So Kazlon, your main fuel, is the most requested resource in the galaxy. That's the one that puts the most demand on your freighter network. And we made a lot of improvements there, especially in cases, again, where the load was very high and there could be contentious threading. We had previously made some updates to shield energy usage that was putting extra strain on Kazlon demand. We reverted those and instead added a new shield energy recharge field that just covered how much do the shields use while they're recharging rather than increasing their static energy usage. And we also took a look at how the resource reservations are handled. So if we talk about this for a sec, like if I look at this particular spaceport here, what we've got for each of these is a level of on-hand that's on hand for each of these resources. So for example, I've got 21,792 Aculon on hand here, right? I've got 5,029, that's my maintain level, which means the spaceport is saying that it wants 5,000 Aculon minimum. So if it ever drops below 5,029, then it will ask for some freighter to bring extra resources to it from one of the other locations that has Aculon to bring it back up over 5,029. So right now it's quite happy about that. But for example, with beryllium quartz, it's only got 444 out of the 1,700 it wants. So there's a freighter somewhere being tasked right now to go get some beryllium quartz. And then there's the reserved, and the reserve reflects what portion of what it has on hand is currently being reserved so that something will pick it up. So basically 1,386 Aculon is currently being reserved of the 21,000 on hand, but something is going to come and grab that Aculon and use it somewhere else. Okay, so what we saw was there were cases where, again, there was a lot of load happening, especially in big galaxies with a lot going on, where because of what was going on with the multi-threading, things were not being handled as well as they should here. When there were multiple things needing, basically creating demands at the same time. We also saw instances, and this was an edge case, but it was a significant one that was affecting a lot of games, where when a planet was first colonized, it was not properly setting all of its resource reservations. We also saw instances where, again, I think related to multi-threading, some of the reserve cargo would not be properly utilized. It would just stay reserved, and never be picked up. And we also tweaked how some of the resource mining rates work. Now, some of that was tweaked down earlier. We've adjusted that a bit more, but we also saw instances where there are many resources at a given location where it wasn't balancing out the mining well enough, and all these were contributing to occasional resource issues. And so there's that. So resource logistics, you'll find in terms of how resources flow across the galaxy, it's going to work a lot better. And I'll just mention briefly about this, that the way the resource economy in Distant Worlds works is it's meant like a sort of hub and spoke system. So when you build your mining stations, you have resources being mined at those locations, or you have mining ships that go out to mine at certain locations, and they'll look for the nearest spaceport. And they'll bring generally those resources back to that nearest spaceport. And that nearest spaceport, which is typically around an inhabited planet, will store up those resources. And it will then act as a point where both its own system and other nearby systems that need resources will demand those resources from it. But you have this network of spaceports throughout your empire, and you'll often see these sort of dotted lines connecting them to show sort of your main resource or trade lanes, though you're not limited to those, but it's just a visual indicator of where your resource flow tends to be the heaviest. So some freighters will do what we call sort of on-demand missions, where just some place needs 100 or 200 or 500 of this. The freighter just goes to the nearest spaceport to grab it and brings it over to where it's needed. But there are other freighters that will also look at those different spaceports and planets and say, where do I have a huge abundance of, let's say, Aculon or Caslon, and where do I need it? And it won't look to necessarily bring those from mining stations, so they can also do that. It'll look to bring those from spaceport to spaceport, effectively from hub to hub, and those are what we call the bulk freighter missions. And you'll see a lot more of those, especially once you've built up the research. For example, if we look up here, you'll see that you start out with small freighters, right? And then when you get up to this tech level 2 tech, you get medium freighters. Well, medium freighters are the first ones that will tend to do bulk transport missions. So once you get up to medium freighters, you'll start to see some of these bulk transport missions really going on. And the same thing will happen when you get to large freighters. And those medium and large freighters generally have enough of these slots and size that they can also have a longer range, so that they can travel longer distances across your empire or for trade purposes to other empires. So one thing not to overlook when it comes to your resource economy, if you're having problems with resources, there are several things not to overlook, but one of the most important is, have you researched your upgraded freighters yet? Okay, a second thing, of course, is, have you looked into mining technology? The more you extract, the more you can mine. Have you actually built enough construction ships to keep up with your queue of new mining locations so that you have enough mines to actually meet your demand in terms of how much your worlds and your spaceports and your construction projects want? That's another one. When you look at also, there are upper limits to how much can be stored at a given spaceport. When you look at your storage systems, have you upgraded your cargo bays? Because the more your cargo bays are, you start out being able to hold 800 in each. 2 tech levels later, you can hold 1,400 in each. That can make a big difference in terms of how much your spaceports can store up before they get to the point where they can't hold more. And that can help with, again, the distribution of resources throughout your galaxy. The other question is taking a look at what all your ship designs use. That's probably a second order thing, but what all your ship designs are using in terms of, are you making ship designs that use the resources that you have the most of, or are you making ship designs that use resources that you don't have much of? And then when it comes to Caslon, some of the most important things come down to your hyperdrives, right? Your early hyperdrives, the skip drive and the warp bubble, are very inefficient as far as Caslon usage. Once you get up to Garax, and especially above Garax, like the really efficient Callistodals, but really a lot of the post-Garax hyperdrives, you get to a lot more efficient use in terms of speed versus fuel usage. And the reactors play a huge part in that too. Your initial reactors, again, are very inefficient. As you go up the reactor tree, your ships become more efficient in terms of generating power. Your hyperdrives become more efficient in terms of using power. And you can do the same thing with engines, where your engines, in terms of how much thrust they get, for the energy that they're using, tie in with the hyperdrives and the reactors to overall make your ships more efficient and put less strain on your Caslon resource system. Alright, so that's a little bit on resources. Any other questions from anyone on resources before I move on to the next part? And I will just move on. So the next area that we addressed was colonization and migration. We had been improving this area before, but I will say that we found a lot of other issues that were relating to this, mostly edge cases, but cases that could come up often enough that they were, creating issues in people's games, where races that were not suitable enough for a given planet. So let's say you have Actarians who really like ocean worlds, right? And you have Mortallon who really like desert worlds. You don't typically want your Actarians trying to live on a desert world or your Mortallon trying to live on an ocean world. They're not going to be very happy there. And the game will try to make that work by increasing the support costs of that world, basically to create a habitable, part of that world through expense where Actarians can survive in the desert. I don't know, you're building them huge swimming pools or something like that, or where Mortallon can survive in the ocean planet, right? That construction of sort of expensive biomes for them is something you usually want to avoid, to not stress out your economy too much. And so we try to address every instance where the migration itself was ignoring that when it shouldn't have, where it was bringing faction races to less suitable worlds than they should have been on. We also were seeing more edge cases where it would be, there were certain situations where if you assigned colonization in certain ways, that it would pick up the wrong race for that world. We try to, again, improve and limit the cases where that would happen. Now, you can still end up with cases where if you're, let's say, again, an Actarian empire and you're colonizing a Mortallon independent, and you have nobody but Actarians, you have no choice but to send an Actarian colonization ship over there to bring that independent into your empire. And in those cases, you just have no choice. It's obviously advisable to change your population policy to resettle those Actarians later on, but we're dealing with mainly the cases where it had a choice and it could have sent someone more suitable to that desert world and didn't, or it should have been migrating races that were more suitable to that desert world, but instead it wasn't. So those are significantly improved. Let's take a look at planetary defenses next. So planetary defense facilities, we got some good reports that at some point, unfortunately, planetary defense facilities broke. I think there was one long-standing issue and one new problem. The new problem broke them. The long-standing issue was that they weren't using all their weapons. So most planetary defense facilities were actually intended to have 5 weapons in effect that they could fire. So if you had a planetary defense facility that was like a planetary missile battery, it effectively was supposed to have 5 missile batteries, but it was only firing 1. And then we had a newer problem that had basically broken them so that they were in many cases not firing at all. All that's resolved, so now the planetary defense facilities should be much more effective than they were with the Aurora update. Any updates to fuel tanker logic and colony events occurring? So fuel tanker logic, yes, I just went through a little bit early in the stream a huge section about fuel tanker improvements. Massive improvements to fuel tanker logic and how they behave in fleets and outside of fleets, massive improvements to fuel and resource logistics and so on. There's also earlier in the stream a lot of performance comparisons, because the biggest single thing you'll see with the Aurora update versus the Hyperspeed update is the Hyperspeed update massively improves performance throughout the galaxy. As far as the colony events, I'm not entirely sure what you're referring to there. I think we have the race-specific events you could turn off, which is different from the colony events. But if you have something where you see an event happening that shouldn't, based on your settings, then by all means, please send that report in to us. So last point here: planetary defense facilities, give them another try in Hyperspeed. They should be much more viable for you in the Hyperspeed update. I already covered the improvements to shield energy usage and the change there. We made some improvements to some edge cases relating to exploration, where it was generating either erroneous messages or causing it to investigate ruins multiple times. No, migration to new colonies works fine with just passenger ships. As long as you have passenger ships, the passenger ships will do migration to new colonies. In terms of colony ships, what you have there is you have found a workaround, if you will, where you have found a different way to do migration, but you are not in any way forced to do migration that way. If you have passenger ships, They will migrate your people automatically between your colonies and try to fill up your new colonies. You can still use the colony ship sort of shortcut if you want to, but you don't have to. I'll discuss briefly the second DLC, the first expansion, at the end of the stream. Okay, so moving through the rest of these things. So research, we found some edge cases where either there were duplicate research bonuses happening or where research projects that shouldn't have been available were showing up in certain cases, either on pirate lists that you could spy on pirates and get them from them, or where you could find them through exploration. That's been those little loopholes there have been fixed. We also found an issue where you could get negative tribute from vassals. That's been fixed. We also added some additional highlighting to the messages to help make sure that if you're getting a bonus of some kind from a particular event, that it's easy to see that it's color-coded and highlighted there. We made some improvements to how the construction queues are handled. So if you have a change of ownership of a construction queue, or if you have an existing spaceport at a colony and you scrap another one, these are mainly edge cases, but cases where construction could get stuck or wouldn't hand off properly when ownership changed. I talked earlier, but I'll just revisit it here. The nebula effects. Performance is greatly improved in nebulas. The effects are improved, but also there was an issue, which is really a pathfinding issue, where ships would sometimes cross into the edge of nebulas when they shouldn't, and thus they would get slowed down. Now, obviously, if you had ships that were much later on in the game, this wasn't as big a concern, though it was still a concern. But early in the game, this could be crippling, where you might have a fleet try to cross through the edge of a nebula, like a gravitic storm nebula, and get damaged and stuck, and it was hopeless, to really recover it at that point. We know what the problem causing this is in some cases, but it requires a much bigger fix to fully solve it. It requires a fix to some of our pathfinding calculations. That's in the works for the future, but in the meantime, we made a change where the borders of nebulas are no longer as scary. If a ship is just barely clipping the nebula, or fleet's just barely clipping the nebula, it's not going to take the full effect, so it shouldn't stop them or slow them down in the same way. It's only if they really go into the core of the nebula that they'll experience the full effects of it, and that's our workaround for now. We also had multiple saves showing that with respect to the Hive carriers and the in-game planet destroyer threat, that those were, in some cases, their AI was not doing the right things in terms of not always picking the right locations for refueling or for self-repair, and thus ending up sometimes stalling out instead of continuing to be a threat. Now, I know that for some of you, the Hive is a bit binary, and we agree it's too binary. It's what we could do for the initial release, but we're also working on, for the future, and this will hopefully be ready in time for the second DLC with the Gazurians and the Quamino, some improvements to expand the Hive threat so that they will have a lot of additional Hive ships of different kinds, and that you won't just get the one big carrier waking up all at once, but that you'll get some smaller ships that might be showing up a little sooner, that it'll be a little bit more scaled to the point at which the Hive is waking up, and it should be it should make it a more interesting and more scalable threat that will not necessarily be either trivial or overwhelming. But as part of that, we've also improved the AI for the Hive in this particular update, and we've done the same in terms of improving the AI for the rare but significant Planet Destroyer event, where you can, towards the end game, I'm assuming most of you have seen this by now, come upon an ancient Planet Destroyer that can, in some cases, wake up and sort of go on a rampage. In other cases, you might be able to get control of it or find the schematics for it to build your own Planet Destroyers, but the AI for it, if it wakes up and starts acting on its own, that AI has been improved. We added some UI improvements so that if you do like shift click, control click, shift control click in areas of the interface that support them, you can now get larger steps for the numeric increments. We provided better visibility of the storm nebula location effects as far as what kind of damage you're taking and whether you're taking a jump slowdown. And in preparation for future expansions, we've added some horizontal scrolling on the Select Your Race section. We added, for modding purposes, a new game event action, Empire as Player, to allow better control over certain story events. We previously expanded a lot of the game events substantially for the Colonization DLC to allow much more interesting events to be done. And we're also improving, in this update and future updates, the support for static character art. And we're going to be improving some other static art access in the future to make modding a little bit easier. And I think that just about covers it. The last thing I'll mention before I start talking about future plans is that this update also includes the first round of official fixes for issues that have been reported with the Colonization. So this will correct some of those reported issues. There's one outstanding part of the feedback on the Colonization DLC that is not yet addressed in Hyperspeed, but will be in the next round of updates. And that's that we've heard from a lot of players that the part of the Icarus story dealing with the Web of Destiny, the Damazi independent colony of Dayut, was unsatisfying in many ways in terms of how it unfolded. We've actually completely rewritten that, and we're implementing a replacement for that in the story. It's still the Web of Destiny, but it's different, and it incorporates a lot of the feedback we've received to allow the player much more agency and many more options in terms of how that all unfolds, and to handle more of the corner cases in terms of things the player could do that might break that part of the story. We recognized that was significant as an early part of the Icarus story, and we wanted to basically make sure that Icarus players were not frustrated by that. So that's going to be coming in the next round of expansions, a big redo of the Web of Destiny storyline. So let's talk a little bit about the future. So we've got plans going forward for Distant Worlds 2. We've got a roadmap that, if you haven't seen it, you should look at our forum on Matrix or the discussion forum for Distant Worlds 2 on Steam. That gives you a list of roadmap items that we're working on, and those will in general be our guiding stars for the areas that we want to improve the most over the course of this year. The sort of main part of the team is always also working on just general fixes and trying to be responsive as we release updates and as we make changes to the game, looking at what the community reports to us on any given week of what's going on. We're trying to be as responsive as we can to those issues while also still progressing some of these longer-term improvements. When it comes to some of these, longer-term improvements, I would expect to see the next round of beta updates come with a delayed but long-planned engine upgrade. So we have, Hyperspeed in and of itself was a major upgrade, but we're going to do an engine upgrade to the Stride engine that sort of sits underneath Distant Worlds 2, and that's going to be able to fix some of the remaining issues that we weren't able to fix in Hyperspeed, and we're willing to risk an earlier low-level engine upgrade. It's also going to involve some of the things I mentioned earlier. We're looking to expand the Hive thread a bit. We're looking to make some additional tweaks to pirates. I hear pirates might be getting something like a pirate cruiser. And we'll try to balance that out so that pirates are a little bit not overwhelming at the beginning, but a little bit more interesting as the game progresses, and can compete a little bit more against the expanded Hive. So there are a lot of graphics improvements already in Hyperspeed, and I went through some of those earlier. The engine upgrade, I think, is mainly going to be focused on fixing some of the remaining issues when it comes to memory management, performance, some crashes, things like that. I don't think it's going to be primarily focused on any kind of visual improvements. The next thing that I think is going to be coming is we've got some other UI improvements that we've been wanting to get to. We've got work on the population policy side of things, where we recognize that this is the weakest part of the AI probably right now. I mean, the AI's biggest weakness right now, which is improved if you increase the difficulty level, is that it can struggle to keep up its economy with the player, and that can then have cascading effects in other areas. And the higher the difficulty, the less it struggles with that. But we want to get away from giving it advantages in higher difficulties, because by default, our standard in Distant Worlds has always been that the AI doesn't cheat; it plays by the same rules that you do. And so what we're looking to do is make sure that you can get population policy management for the AI that is up to snuff, both in terms of when it comes to the Dayut and their slavery policy, when it comes to policies like exterminate, and when it comes to policies like resettle or do not accept, that it is able to actually intelligently assign those properly, which will help its economy a lot. There are other areas regarding how it manages some of the research priorities with respect to colonization and terraforming that we also want to improve. The AI does do those, especially if it has enough money for them, but it does them a little bit too late now, and we're seeing players outpace it because of that. So we'll be making some improvements to the AI on that. And I think if you look through the roadmap, you'll see a lot of other areas there that we're going to be looking to improve over the course of the rest of the updates through this year. In terms of the expansions, we're currently targeting late summer for a release of the Gazurian and Quamino DLC, which has entered internal testing, and we're trying to again raise the bar a little bit more with those guys and take on the lessons we learned from the base game as well as the Colonization DLC. We're also working on starting to improve the base factions. I'll just comment briefly on the Quamino and the Gazurians. Those of you who may remember them from Distant Worlds 1, those of you who may not know them, the Quamino are sort of the ultimate research faction. They're sort of the galaxy's introverts, and what they really want to do is be left alone and do their research, and they're very, very good at it. They're also very interested in puzzles of all kinds and stuff like that. So they, if your primary goal in terms of playstyle is to do the most research possible, they're going to be your guys. And what we're hoping to do as part of that release is to also make some improvements to the tech tree, especially as far as repeatable techs that the Quamino may end up needing. The Gazurians, on the other hand, are the fastest growing race in the galaxy. They multiply like nobody else, even exceeding the Beskara. And those are going to be a sort of play-wide faction for those of you who like that kind of gameplay. If you're thinking of things like, the Zerg or something like that, they're sort of an insectoid, play very wide, grow very fast faction, but they're relatively slow on research, but they have other ways of getting it. And we'll be talking more about those folks as we get into the late summer. But I'm expecting that DLC will be out sometime in the late summer, along with another official update preceding it. And then let's talk a little bit about later in the year. Again, go back to the roadmap for more details on what else we're going to be working on in the updates for later in the year. But what we're also working on, and I mentioned this earlier when we were dealing with the Ikaru and the Dayut DLC and the Aurora launch, is that we are working on a full expansion for Distant Worlds 2, which has to do with the Shakturi. And I'm not ready yet to deliver any more details on anything about the Shakturi, but I will just say that the timing on that is going to be either end of this year or beginning of next, and it just depends on when it's ready. We're going to, as again, we learned with Distant Worlds 2's initial release that we were not aware enough of the issues that existed, and we've generally been trying to test the heck out of everything since then and trying to keep things in the oven as long as possible to make sure that we're really, really sure that all issues are worked out as much as they can be with the team we've got. So we'll be proceeding carefully with that since it's our first major expansion, but that will introduce a major endgame threat. So it will no longer just be you and the other empires competing against each other. It will no longer just be sort of minor threats, relatively speaking, like the Hive or the automated planet destroyer. There will be a major endgame threat coming with the Shakturi expansion. And I guess I can say this: when the Shakturi come, there will be a lot more world destroyers in general. And let me see what other questions we've got here. We will be doing a new tester wave when it comes to the Shakturi expansion. So we're happy with our existing testers for the Gazurian and Quamino, but when it comes to the Shakturi, we'll be doing new tester recruitment to expand our test team for that. Is it going to come with the friendly neighborhood AI too? I'm not sure what you mean by that one, Magi. And yeah, well, the Shakturi, the thing is with the Ikaro and Dayut and the Kwamino and the Gazurians, these have officially been content expansions, right? They're basically ways to add more playable factions that add new playstyles to the game. But they've also, each of them, included some feature improvements too. And we're doing a similar thing with the Gazurian and Kwamino in that some of these improvements to expand the hive, again, we're hoping that gets in. I can't guarantee what's going to be in an update in the future, but we're hoping that we'll be able to, in time for the Gazurian and the Kwamino DLC, expand the hive, make some improvements to the pirates, and improve some of the tech tree. That's all because we're working on the Kwamino and Gazurian DLC, and these things kind of fit in with them. And there will be something similar with the Shakturi, but we're seeing the Shakturi as not just a content expansion, but as a feature expansion. And with all these expansions, what we're trying to do is make sure that we balance out and just keep improving the base game alongside adding stuff into these expansions and DLCs. So everyone, whether you buy the DLC or the expansion or not, you're going to continue getting updates that improve the base game and continue fixing the issues we see reported with it. But then we're also going to be adding some features into the Shakturi expansion, mostly relating to, again, the Shakturi threat and what is involved in fighting a giant endgame menace. And more details on that will be coming later this year. I can't really go into a lot of detail then. Thank you, Rollhacks. Yeah, Linux is not officially supported, but there are those of us on the team who use it and who would love to see Distant Worlds working well on it. So we'll put some time into that as we can. And I think that just about covers my news for today. So I guess I'll just ask you all, is there anything else that you all have questions on while I've got a little more time here today? We can talk through some things. Otherwise, I'll wrap this one up and encourage you all to check back in on Friday when the Hyperspeed update releases. And if you have other folks you know who play Distant Worlds 2, make sure they hear the news, especially if they've had problems. There are a lot of underlying technical problems also that Hyperspeed fixes that weren't yet fixed in Aurora. So we've continued moving that ball forward. We are working on improving the base factions, and that is starting with the humans, Saki. That's going to be going on through the summer. I don't yet know when the first base faction, updated base faction, will release, but I'm hoping that we will have something about the humans out by the end of the summer, and then we'll just proceed through that. The first one I think is going to be the toughest, and then that'll sort of set the template for the rest. Then we can hopefully move through the rest more quickly. Modding galaxy size time frame, you mean in terms of doing even bigger galaxies? Well, our first priority has been to fix all the performance issues people were having within the existing galaxy sizes, and I think Hyperspeed moves us massively in the right direction on that. I think we're going to wait and see what the feedback is on the Hyperspeed update once it goes official and get a sense of how much more performance needs to improve before we decide on, any larger galaxy sizes. Because right now I think the 2,000 star galaxies are still giving most people's systems a really good workout. Any planetary mechanics arriving? Could you clarify what you mean by that, Von Artel? And Mad Menon, yes, we're as I mentioned with the Ikaro and the Dayut DLC, we are planning to revisit every one of the base factions to try to bring them up to that Ikaro and Dayut level. So that means both revisiting their balance in relation to the new factions and making sure that they have some of the new interesting gameplay mechanics and unique events that some of the new factions came with. DirectX 12 with the new stride, Saki. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one, sorry, but I'll ask for the next time. As far as making a possible start in the Soul system, so if you've played as the humans and you've played through the human storyline, then you would probably know why you don't start in the Soul system. Could we do that as an option, as sort of an alternate story setting in the future? Yeah, sure. And I think anyone who wants to mod that now could also do that. If you want any new colony... Well, it depends what you define as a reasonable time, Kopi, because you found a workaround that sort of hyper accelerates that process. So I guess in relation to that, passenger slips are slow. But yeah, I mean, I think we'll have to take a look at that and see what we can do. I'd love to see more depth on planetary facilities, maybe process resources. Okay, I see what you mean. So we are adding, as we go, more flavor events for the colonies. Planetary facilities, I mean, there are about 3 times as many planetary facilities in Distant Worlds 2 as there were in Distant Worlds 1. And usually with each new faction, we're giving them some unique facilities, like the Quamino and the Gazurians will both have some unique planetary facilities. Processed resources is a different one, and that's an interesting question. So I understand what you're talking about. You're talking about like the Victoria-like economy, stuff like that. That is something that we may in the future get to in Distant Worlds 2, but that's not on our current roadmap. We have a lot of other stuff to do before we, before we have to basically finish walking and running before we can sprint to that degree. This would be an interesting addition, though, I think, to the economic system. But I think we would need some additional improvements to the private economy and to the UI to let people fully explore what a economy with processed resources would mean. Galaxy size and star numbers. Oh, you mean like the sector size and the star numbers? I think we originally limited that because there were some cases where with the colonization range and the hyperdrive range that you could end up with generated galaxies with relatively few stars spread over too many sectors where it was kind of impossible to get to other stars. But we can take another look at that. It could be that that has improved. And certainly I think it shouldn't be a big deal to add something where we give the player the option of unlocking it if they don't mind, running into a potential problem where they have to overcome that by maybe researching further into hyperdrives and such before they can actually get anywhere. And I think the other thing I'll mention there is we're also planning to add some additional options in the future to the Galaxy setup when it comes to allowing, since as part of what we've done with the baseline faction revisits and with the new factions is we've been a little bit more limiting on the governments they can choose by default. We also want to add an option there to let people turn that off and pick any government they want. So if you wanted to be, for example, a human hive mind, that you could, if you turn that option on. Can the coordinates be made actually functional or removed? Yeah, that's one of those things where, the coordinate system is functional in the sense that we have coordinates in the galaxy, and when it references a point, it refers to the coordinates, but they're not meaningful to the player, which is why typically the only instance that I'm aware of where they're used right now is with regard to some of these navigational coordinates that are used for the story events. When it uncovers a new location for you that you haven't been to before, it tells you that that location is at a certain navigational coordinate, because it can't assume that you know the name of the system or anything like that, and then it gives a ping on the map that shows you, here's this location, so you know to go there. So we certainly need to make that better. It's not ideal that we're throwing up a long coordinate string to the player without really explaining what it is, so I will say we will improve that. Yeah, process resources would be a big change, but I think it is an interesting direction in a more distant future to look at for Distant Worlds. For folks who like the economy part of the playstyle and the resource part of the playstyle, I think it would add a lot, but it would be a major change. Yeah, actually on our roadmap, if you look at our roadmap, which I referenced earlier, we actually have we're on our roadmap adding the measurement tool and adding search to the Galactopedia and all the entities that are in the galaxy. And that's one of the things that will be in before the end of this year, is the search function and the measurement functions. Agri-worlds, industrial worlds, military worlds, etc. Well, we do have some specialized facilities that we added in sort of in that direction, but in terms of, specializing every world type, yeah, that's another step maybe to look at in the future. Yeah, I mean, what I'm saying about the processed resources is really that I think it's an area where we could go in the future. I think it could be done in an interesting way. I think it would be a major task to do it, but I think for when you look at the private economy, there's a lot of things we could do with the private economy, a lot of directions that we thought about in Distant Worlds 1, and that we're also still thinking about in Distant Worlds 2. I think the main thing that probably influences whether such a thing would happen would be how much support we hear from the community, from people who like that sort of focus on the private economy, to have that private economy side of things be expanded. I mean, we could differentiate the private economy more by government type, for example. That's one thing we could do. We could also take the private economy and split it up into certain competing factions. We could have more detailed types of trade treaties in terms of how they affect the private economy. We could have more detailed interactions between the state and the private economy, and we could have processed resources, and we could even have facilities or other stations that act as, processors rather than just collectors or stores. All kinds of things like that could happen. I'm not saying they will. I'm just saying I could see that there is room for that type of thing in the future if it's what people want. I will say right now we have plans that, with the Structura expansion, that's a pretty big plan of ours that we're already, working towards. And then we have some other plans for the feature expansion beyond that, which I can't talk about at all yet. But beyond that, there's a lot of debate, and the future's kind of wide open there as far as where we go. Independents are another good example of where we could make the private economy in effect more interesting, and just by making independence a little more interesting. There's a lot of room for growth. There's a lot of room for things, but we're at the stage because unfortunately, and I talked about this in my roadmap update as well, unfortunately because there were so many issues with the initial release, our focus has been, rightly so, on making sure that all those issues are resolved and that we sort of improve the initial release as much as possible and invest in that initial release as much as possible, and frankly earn back your trust that we really do stand behind this game, and that we can actually fix those issues that some people have seen with it or have had with it. At the same time, we want to make sure for those customers and players who weren't having problems that we are now, as of the Occur in the Deep DLC, also going to be regularly delivering new stuff for you all to play with. New play styles, new features, things that just make the galaxy more rich and more interesting rather than just fixing bugs and improving performance. So I guess I will finish up here with one last thing. I'm just going to, for those who joined late, I'm just going to one last time go through the comparison between Aurora and Hyperspeed. And then I will say farewell to everyone and thank you for your support of DW2. So this is, again, one more time, I'm looking at a save here that I'm about to put up on the screen that is a very large galaxy with a lot of ships, and it looks at a location where there's about 2,000 ships fighting, and there's about 100,000 ships going around in the galaxy, and we're going to look at it in the Aurora update, which is the current official update, and then we're going to look at it in the Hyperspeed update. So here's the Aurora update, and what you'll see as I'm looking at this battle here is it's resolving, but it's kind of stuttery. Things are moving kind of slowly. You're seeing some hiccups. You're not seeing all the weapon effects always resolving or being displayed. If you could hear the sound, you would also hear the sound is kind of stuttering and sometimes frizzing out. And you'll see that continue to happen. The battle is resolving, though. It is something where on Aurora, if you load this massive save, it will eventually resolve the battle. Things will eventually proceed. But one of the problems is that with Aurora and the previous updates, in order to do that, it would tend to focus a lot of the system resources on what the player was looking at, and that could create a lag, effectively an asynchronicity between what the player is looking at and what's happening in the rest of the galaxy and how quickly that's all processing. And we didn't want that, but that's how it was working. So with Hyperspeed, we made massive improvements throughout the entire game. Basically, we redid a whole bunch of stuff to get it to really work better. And so if you look out here, we've zoomed out to the galaxy again, and this is the Aurora update, and you're seeing a lot of these ship symbols flying around the galaxy, and you can see them moving, but you'll also see that some of them aren't really moving. Some of them are moving only very occasionally. And overall, it's a picture of a game, in this case, under the Aurora update, that's so big that the CPU, on my system, is struggling to keep up with all the things that have to be processed in this living galaxy. And what we wanted to do was greatly improve this and to greatly diminish this phenomenon of the things that you're looking at are processing, but the things that you're not looking at are processing a lot slower. Okay? So I'm going to now show you what this looks like in the Hyperspeed update, which is coming out as an official update at the end of this week, and we will compare. So this is the Hyperspeed update here, and in the Hyperspeed update you can see that this battle is now proceeding pretty smoothly. There aren't really any significant performance issues, even though there's 2,000 ships fighting here. You're seeing all the weapon effects. If you could hear the sound, all the sound is also being played. So basically, looking at this 2,000 ship combat in Hyperspeed is sort of the same as looking at, let's say, a 100 ship combat or 200 ship combat in Aurora. We're really seeing massive performance improvements on all processors, including Intel and AMD. And I went over earlier in this stream a lot of the game settings, which I encourage those of you who haven't seen the beginning of the stream, look back at that first part where I go through the game settings in detail, because there's a lot of game settings that we added that let you customize your performance and your stability for your system. Like for AMD GPUs, we strongly recommend trying one of the Vulkan, the DXVK options in the rendering mode. We find those perform better and are more stable with the AMD drivers. To my knowledge, the X3D chips should work quite well because Distant Worlds 2 is very CPU heavy. So now if we take a look at this galaxy, this is the same galaxy we were looking at under Aurora. Now if you take a look at these same ships in the same galaxy, in the same save, in the same location under the Hyperspeed update, you can see that everything is moving. Everything is active. And it was active and it was moving even while we were zoomed into that location and watching that battle. Everything in the galaxy was active. The galaxy was well and truly alive. Now I'm running this save on a computer that the save is actually too big for, in the sense that this is a galaxy size that's too big for my computer. So you saw a little bit of a brief hiccup there, but everything is generally resolving like 10, 100, even sometimes 1,000 times faster than in Aurora. And the end result is, even on big games, you can play much further into the game. You can have a lot more happening. The galaxy is more alive, and this helps the AI too, because one of the strange phenomenons of the previous performance issues is that since you as the player were diverting more of the processor than you necessarily should have had to what you were looking at, that also starved some of the things the AI was doing. So that results in an ironic way, helping the AI too, because it gets more processor time. Now, I mentioned earlier, and I'll finish with this, take a look at the game settings that I went over earlier in this stream, because it's actually the game settings that will allow you to also tune how much of your GPU and CPU the Hyperspeed update wants to use. By default, it will use a lot. For some of you, you may not want it to be using all of your GPU and CPU, so make sure you take a look at those game settings, the FPS limit, the system load target, so that you can set it to what you want it to use. But even if it's using the same amount that it was using on Aurora, it's still going to be doing a lot more work with that same amount of processor, and it's going to be using a lot more threads and cores than it was using before. Okay? So folks, this is where I'm going to call it. I want to thank you all for tuning in today. Please help us spread the word about the Hyperspeed update, and for anyone you know who might have had performance issues or any kind of system compatibility issues with Distant Worlds 2, including the Aurora update, please ask them to try it again with Hyperspeed, or if you're having those issues, please try it again. Please take a look at those settings, and let us know. Once Hyperspeed comes out this Friday, let us know how it works for you, and we're going to keep working on the game and improving it. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you all. We thank you for all the support you've given us and for sticking with Distant Worlds 2, and we think this is going to continue to be a big year for Distant Worlds 2 with a lot more improvements, a lot more content coming out. So thank you, everyone. Take care.